Hey there, welcome to Transform Your Workplace. This is a show that arms busy leaders and HR professionals with ideas and tools to build workplaces that people love. Every week, we dig into proven practices that help you attract great talent, develop people, and drive results. Because when work works for humans, the business wins too. Before we get into the conversation today, I want to give a quick thank you to our sponsor, Xenium HR. If juggling separate vendors for payroll, benefits, and HR has you feeling like the hub of a very messy wheel, you're not alone. Most companies have data scattered everywhere, and every payroll change triggers a waterfall of HR paperwork. Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution puts everything under one roof: HR management, payroll administration, and even optional benefits support, backed by your own dedicated service team, so you can finally focus on growing the business instead of chasing forms. Need a partner that blends state-of-the-art tech with real human expertise? That's Xenium. People experts, problem solvers, and your guide to simpler, compliant, people-focused operations. Learn more at xeniumhr.com. All right, today's episode, I'm sitting down with Dr. Angela Jackson, the author of the brand new book, The Win-Win Workplace: How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Success. Angela's research flips the old zero-sum mentality on its head and shows how investing in people pays off in real dollars. During the episode, you'll learn why centering employee voice is step one and how quick, low-cost feedback loops can surface game-changing ideas, like shaving hours off of a delivery route or boosting production just by installing AC. How to reimagine benefits so they can meet actual life needs. Think emergency funds and flexible stipends instead of dusty one-size-fits-none packages. And what a true ownership mindset looks like. And spoiler, employees start acting like homeowners, not renters. And finally, the metrics Angela uses to prove all of this drives productivity, retention, and profit. If you're ready to move from a transactional paycheck for labor model to a culture where people and performance rise together, this conversation is for you. All right, let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Dr. Angela Jackson. Dr. Angela Jackson, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, Brandon, thank you so much for having me. Excited to have this conversation.
Well, congratulations too. This is your first book, The Win-Win Workplace: How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Success. What was it like to write this book?
In writing the win-win workplace, it was really cathartic because so many of us spend, a third of our lives at work. And when you're looking at the headlines, most of them talk about all the things that are going wrong in the workplace. And what I had an opportunity to do with this book and the research behind it is actually interview CEOs, workplace leaders, CHROs, chief learning officers who are actually investing in people and building what I call the win-win workplace, the workplaces of the future where both people can thrive, but also seeing that correlation to the business thriving.
Angela, in the introduction, you described this life-changing kind of pivot moment when you realized that many people, this modern workforce, can feel like a rat race. And you came crashing down at some point. Maybe share what sparked that epiphany and what shaped the ideas in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, I actually tell my backstory because when we talk about that zero sum workplace, I feel like a lot of my life I worked in that. I put my head down. I'm Gen X. I put my head down. I thought the social contract between me and my employer was me getting a paycheck, and I was willing to do whatever it took to advance. Come in early, stay late. And at my last job before that pivotal moment, which is a car accident, I was an executive at Nokia, the mobile phone company. And I had this career that was like up in the air if you've seen the movie. I was the million+ miler on American Airlines. And, I was flying from New York, where I was based, to LA. And I was going to be there for literally 12 hours so I could present at a meeting. And then the next day I was going to get on a plane and go to Europe Europe. And ironically, as I was driving to this meeting, I was already thinking about like not missing my flight. I wasn't really being present or thinking about what had to happen at the meeting. I was just really on to the next thing to check off of my work to-do list. And in that moment, I had an accident, and the accident, was my fault. I was about to miss a turn, and I turned quickly, and I was hit by a car. And in the instance, my busy life literally stopped in that moment. I was in physical therapy for months, sitting on my couch, and I had a lot of time to think about work, what it meant to me. And what I realized in that moment is because I was so busy, I hadn't spent time with my family. I was single. And frankly, I wasn't happy, even though I was spending so much time working. And I had to think to myself, there has to be a better way than that. And that really sparked this transition in work around researching and finding out how were people making work more sustainable, and how is that sustainable workplaces really driving better financial outcomes for businesses.
Talk about the zero sum workplace that many organizations have. Like, describe what you mean by that and how the win win approach is in contrast to that.
Yeah, so when we think about that zero sum workplace, again, with me being Gen X, it's the one where the social norms of work, anything personal that's happening to you, you check that at the door when you come in because it's only about the job. And we really don't care what's happening for you at home. You are replaceable. So if you don't think that you'd want to work here and follow our rules, then you go somewhere else. And those rules could be somewhat arbitrary. And we've seen those lately with the return to office mandate. We saw during COVID that people could do lots of jobs that we didn't think were possible in a remote setting. But now leaders are wanting to take us back to the office. Why? Because most of them will say something like, we work better in person, we work better together. And that may very well be true. But the assumption in that is that people don't want to come to the office because they just don't want to come to the office and they have a preference, versus working remotely has allowed many people to like take care of their caregiving responsibilities for elderly parents, relatives, and their children. It saved them money and time on transportation and gas. And so what we saw in some of these win-win workplaces is that these leaders were taking into account the lived experiences of their employees and making sure that they were creating benefits that could actually help people to be in the mindset and set the conditions where people could work and thrive. They did that not because it's the nice thing to do for their employees, as it is, but they also did it out of self-interest. They saw that these practices and policies increase productivity, increase the tenure, reduce turnover. And those are real hard numbers when we're looking at rising talent cost in the market today.
When you think about the organizations that are still in that kind of that zero sum workplace, and you're really trying to convince them like the win win is going to give you all these benefits, like this is going to take a mindset shift for a lot of people. Like, what sort of case do you make to them to try to convince them like the win win approach is really the way you need to operate your organization?
Yeah, and I love, Brandon, that you said changing mind shifts, because when I looked at this book, mental models around work that we've all grown in, even if we didn't like it, it's what is the norm. And a lot of people have been successful when you think about our C suite, and they don't even realize that it didn't work for many of their people. And so when I'm making that case to leaders to think about this, I talk about that we are entering a place that has 5 generations. When we hear from millennials and Gen Z, which are going to be the majority of the workplace by 2030, we need to take seriously what their expectations are around work. I'll give you an example. I feature a story, Joe Nolan, who wrote a testimonial of the book. He's the CEO of Eversource, a large, Fortune 500 energy company. In his 60s, self-proclaimed boomer. He said to me, when I'm talking to other CEOs, they complain about millennials and Gen Z. He goes, Angela, I just stop them. I say, I can't say that I understand them, but what I know is true is that they are going to be the majority of the workplace. And so if I'm going to be successful, I need to understand them. And basically what he was saying in substance is those conversations about what workers are today and how they're different than workers of yesterday, they don't bring us anything. They're anti-productive. What we need to lead with now is curiosity, understanding what this new generation of employees want and what's going to motivate them to lean in. And what we're seeing now is the motivation is far beyond beyond just the paycheck. Like that's the base. They're looking for to work for companies where values are aligned. They're looking for that work life integration that some of us never had. And they're looking for employers to actually show that they are invested in them beyond what they can just provide to the company.
Yeah, you're so right. Many employers are not even asking the questions and collecting the feedback from employees. And so they never really know what makes them motivated and want to produce at a level. What's a really good way of collecting the feedback on a regular basis and acting on it? Because I think that's the key is some organizations and leaders, they ask for feedback and they don't do anything with it.
Right, you're exactly right. And what I found in researching this book is that if you go to every single employer, they will tell you how they're listening to their employees, how they're gathering feedback. But if you juxtapose that with the stat that you've got 48% of US workers who are saying that their employer doesn't care about them. So you've got employers are spending, millions and billions of dollars in investing in ways that their employees are not even feeling. And so when I wrote the first chapter of the book on pillar one, it's called Centering Employee Voice. And exactly what you explained is saying, let's actually start asking employees what matters most to them and their ability to actually show up fully at work. So that's number one, taking that feedback and then actually working with it, working through it with their management teams to say, okay, what can we operationalize? What investments can we make? And then there's going to be some feedback that they're not going to be able to do. And what we saw in the book is that the employers who actually really wrestled with the feedback and really from a form of and position of curiosity and tried to say what they could implement, what they cannot implement right now, and what they're not going to do in the future, and actually take the time to respond and share that thinking with their employees, employee trust went up, employee loyalty went up. And when I went in with my team and we asked the employees, why is this so important to you? I remember distinctly, we had one woman say, well, first of all, I just appreciated that they listened and that they came back to me and respected me enough that they came back to me and shared what they can do. And now I can't say I agree with everything, but I just really appreciate that they brought me into their thinking. And that's what we saw, even with chapter 2 in the book that's called Humanistic Relationships. Like, how are we structuring relationships around support, around trust, and how do we flatten that experience of hierarchies? And we see that every day, Brandon, where you've got a leadership team that comes in and, they lay the heavy hand. They're like, we're doing this because we said so. That has worked in the past. What we're seeing with these win-win workplaces, what they're doing is different, is that they're saying, this is what we're offering up. This is our direction, but we've heard your feedback. This is how it's been integrated, and this is how we are moving forward together. Again, it's just a language change, but that's really going far to shift some of these mental models.
Yeah, you're so right because like many organizations are still trying to pivot. Transactional paycheck for labor approach. It's very transactional. It's not accounting for the whole human. But I think a human centered culture would be a lot better one to work at. And it probably results in a lot more loyalty, profits, and all the benefits. What does this look like in practice, though, to have a
So
more human centered organization?
absolutely. We can start with listening. And what I get excited about, a lot of people will read this book and say, okay, some large companies, of course they can do it. But what I'm excited about in this moment is that with technology, we can all start listening. We've had small and medium sized businesses start with a Google form where you actually are asking questions on a more regular basis. You're not waiting for a year to get someone's feedback. Some of the best employers are doing this on a quarterly basis. Some are doing it on a monthly basis. Because we have generative AI, we can actually take all of that feedback and we can have it analyze it for us and put a report, literally put the survey results in and say, what changes should we suggest? What are the top 3 things that our employees are telling us? And making sure that we're taking that information and we're getting to our frontline managers, which I talk about in the book, moving frontline managers to frontline leaders. They need this data and they need tips on how they might operationalize it. The second thing that we're doing is like, once you have that data, is really thinking about the strategies that you can employ to meet a challenge that's been raised by your employees, or they might be offering up an opportunity to improve the business. One of my favorite stories I write in the book around this is there was a company, CHI Doors, and they went in, when new management went in, they asked the employees, what can we do to improve the culture of the company to improve productivity. The employers actually gave information. And one delivery driver told me this great story. He said for 5 years he'd been working for the company and he'd been going the route that he was given via the GPS. He was from the town. He knew the route was wrong. He knew that there was more efficient routes, but no one had ever asked him. And so when they actually asked, he said for the 10th time, he said he gave the advice and he was trying to give this new management team the benefit of the doubt. And they actually did listen to him and they ran the analysis. He was right on his route, but then that also spurred them to look at all of the driving routes. And what happened after this, they were able to optimize the route. It saved time, it saved gas money, and I thought more importantly, it saved employees frustration. And what we saw with the culture is that once employees saw these changes being made and their advice being taken and feedback being taken seriously, they gave other ideas. The company went so far as when they were thinking about improvements to the building, they went to the employees again and said, where do you think we should invest this money? And it was simple things. One thing that they had noticed is that production went down in the summer, and employees said, it'd be great if we could get central air in these buildings. That could help. They put in central air, and guess what? The production went up. Why? Because it was more comfortable for the employees to do their work. And so that investment paid for itself. And those are the points I'm trying to make in the Win-Win Workplace book is that, yes, we're investing in people, but we're doing that because we're showing that when people are thriving, that we're implementing their feedback and their ideas, that has a direct correlation to lift on the financial side. So real tangible savings or increased sales on the business side.
In your third chapter, you talk about the whole in play. I love this. This introduces the idea of intersectionality and embracing each person's full identity. How do you feel like recognizing employees, their backgrounds, whether experience, culture, how does this lead to stronger teamwork, more innovation, and all the things that lead up to a win-win workplace?
When I think about this and the importance of thinking about intersectionality, the thinking about what happens and acknowledging what happens in someone's personal life, their personal experience, directly impacts their ability to fully show up at work. This was laid bare during the pandemic, right? We were invited into our coworkers' homes. We saw their children. We got vulnerable with each other and talking about sicknesses that we may have not talked about before. And what we saw is that people have whole lives outside of work. And so by acknowledging those and rewriting what I call in that zero-sum workplace, that anything personal you check at the door, which, Brandon, you and I and everyone else and your listeners who are listening know that even though we didn't talk about it at work, it was still present in our minds. But what we're doing now by acknowledging people's lived experiences, what they're bringing to the table, is that it's helping them actually engage and bring those experiences to the table. I write in the book about a veteran who had been, working for a manufacturing company. He had been trained to put his head down, to never complain about anything. And in the book, we find out that he begins showing up late for work. He had some issues around transportation. His car broke down. He was dependent on public transportation, and the bus kept being late. And he didn't want to go in and tell his manager that. He just took personal responsibility. So they had a couple of development conversations with him. He never explained to them, look, my car broke down. I've been depending on public transportation. When the bus is late, I'm late. And this company had a 3 strikes rule, and they're literally going to let him go because he's on his 3rd strike. And it just so happened his manager was out on break, and she saw him getting off the bus and doing a full-on Usain Bolt, sprint to the door. And once he comes up and he's huffing and puffing, he goes in, she finishes her break and she goes, what's the matter? And she pulls him aside. She goes, well, I was sprinting because I was going to be late again, depending on this bus, and it's crazy. And she goes, well, why didn't you tell me? He goes, based on my military training, we just don't make excuses. We put our head down. I felt like it was my responsibility to get in. And it was an eye-opening moment for that manager. And she was able to go advocate for him with her senior leadership. But this is what we mean by intersectionality. It's all of our experiences in work and what we believe about work that shapes us. When I think about this gentleman, Gerald, he was shaped on you don't make any excuses, you get the job done, you put your head down. And because of that, he didn't bring anyone into his thinking. And he was going to be let go because of something that was really out of his control. And he was an A player and had been so for like 6, 8 months before this issue with his car started happening. And I have heard, as I've gone on this book tour, so many stories like this. This happens way more than we think about. Now, I'll give you another example. From my colleagues at Harvard, there was a study that came out that 42% of workers who have a critical health condition have missed a doctor's appointment because they didn't want to tell their manager at work. And why didn't they want to tell their manager at work? It's really because of that old zero-sum workplace. When they were asked, they said, I thought my employer would look differently on me. I thought that I'd be on that list to get, eliminated, or if there's a reduction in force, I didn't want a target on my back. And so what we're saying with these intersectional identities is that we have to disabuse ourselves of some of those old workplace norms. We have to relook at them and say, are they helpful in this moment? Are there ways that we can do this differently? And that's what we're trying to get across in this whole section of letting people with their full lives come in and trust and building that psychological safety that they can be in conversation and community with their manager without feeling that they're going to have a target on their backs.
Oh, that's so powerful. I mean, the hidden struggles are real. Like these are happening. We're real people. And I really hope that managers and leaders really get an opportunity to have some one-on-one conversations with their people and really get to understand what's going on in their life. Do you find that the leaders that you're talking about in the win-win workplace are really having these conversations about the whole person?
I was just with the head of Uber Health, for example, and we were talking after a conference. This is literally last week. And he was saying to me, we are burning out our A players. We've got this culture of go fast, where, a tech company and move. But he was like, I'm seeing that that's not sustainable. He was like, as a leader, I've tried to signal to my employees that, what's going on outside of work, your family, that's most important. He goes, I make sure everyone knows that I'm leaving at 5 because I have to go to my son's soccer game. I've tried to communicate that, but still I wasn't seeing people shift their practice. He goes, the second thing I did was I put on our Slack channel how different people have different office hours. And I asked my team to put on their preferred working hours too, so we could just start there. He was like, one thing that came up is that I had an employee that loved to leave at 4 because she was, playing a new instrument. And that was just so important part of hers. And so she goes, I like to start early and I like to end at 4. He said, just that acknowledgement of sharing preferences so that people could be mindful and cognizant when they're reaching out to their peers that there are certain things that are equally or more important than work. And if we can be empathetic and take that into account, you're going to get a better response from your team member. You're going to be meeting them when they have their best work. And so things like that actually matter, what the leader is doing. When is the leader responding to emails? He also shared with me, even if he gets an email on Sunday, he doesn't respond to noon on Monday because he wants to break the habits of people expecting to respond on the weekend. And he doesn't want to feed that behavior. So there are small and big ways as leaders that we can operationalize this. And what I'd say is people say, well, how much does this cost? It costs time. It costs time for that leader to put the Slack message and to survey his employees to understand their work preferences, to set the tone as a leader to say, best case scenario, we're adhering to these preferences so people can do their best work. These are the hours that we're going to be together. And we know that everyone's online. It sets time to culturally share what you're doing and bring people in your mindset. And that's what we're seeing the leaders in the win-win workplace do differently. They're actually taking the time to not only model this behavior, but to bring their employees into their thinking on how they see this as actually critical to driving the win-win workplace is critical to driving business.
What you're saying too ties in so nicely with your pillar on reimagining employee benefits. And I've always thought like a one size fits all benefits package is not cutting it nowadays. People have real life needs and everybody's at a different stage in their life. How can employers and leaders really get creative with reimagining benefits to truly reflect their day-to-day realities and where they're at in their life?
So, first, I think the big thing is we have to stop assuming that the benefits that work for us work for everyone else. I write about this in the book. There was a CEO of a fast casual restaurant, and he had given everyone, including frontline employees, a match, their 401k. And he brought me in because he was perplexed because no one was taking them up on the offer of this match, especially at the front lines. And he goes, Angela, do you know why? And I said, no, I don't, but have you asked them? And to his credit, he did listen and he went back and asked them. And what we found out is that while a lot of the employees appreciated the match, they had just other issues that were more present and important as it related to finances. And so what he did was to his credit, he took the money that they were going to spend on the match. And based on what he heard, he created an emergency fund where employees, if they had any type of emergency, could use money from this fund. And it was set at a certain amount to help with any life emergency that came up. What we found out is that, some people were able to use that when a caregiver didn't show up. Some of them used it for when a parent or a relative died unexpectedly and they had funeral expenses. And what we saw with that fund was that people used it in different ways that were most important to them in that moment. And when we went back 6 months later and we began interviewing employees about what that meant for them, what the benefits, and what was eye opening for me is that some of them said, well, I just felt like the company really cares about me. And the one woman where it benefited her when she was talking about the funeral expenses, she goes, when my husband died unexpectedly, she looked to her left, right. She was like, these are the people. She was looking at the people on the front line that were here for me. And the company was there for me. I had this unexpected, expense. We were going through probate. Like I really needed it at that time. And that company was here for me. And like, I want to be here for it. And again, companies are being creative. So they're doing, again, emergency benefits. One company that I love is called Compt. They take the money that you were going to spend on your free lunch or, your office perk, and they put that on a platform where employees can actually pick the perk that matters most to them. And so that could be coffee at their local coffee shop, or it could be, purchasing an item, or it could be for a wellness day. And one amazing thing that happened from Compt as they began researching where these dollars were used, most of them were being used at community organizations and local businesses. And so that goes into that win-win again. You're giving employees what they want. They're actually using these benefits and you're investing in your local community. And so again, when we're talking about this win-win workplace, it's helping the employees. The employees are staying, they're happier, they're more productive, which again leads to that financial look that we talk about in the book, how we're seeing, a lift on productivity, receiving, reduced turnover. We're seeing higher engagement, and that directly impacts the bottom line. And I give those case studies in the book.
You talk in the book about, over the last several years, we've had like the great resignation, the quiet quitting, and a lot of internal talent is walking out the door. You argue that ongoing learning and development opportunities inside the organization can really benefit the culture and people and keep them there long term. What does that look like in an everyday workplace of ongoing training and development?
Yeah, this is such a critical point. In doing this book, I've talked to literally dozens of chief learning officers. And what I've heard from them is in this moment in particular, all of the energy and budgets are going to generative AI and use cases around technology. And what I propose in this book is that we're saying that our employees are the most valuable resource. How are we thinking about upskilling them? When you talk to employees and you look at the surveys, employees are really depending on their employers to upskill them, to tell them what are the jobs of the future. And as they should, because our employers are creating these jobs of the future, jobs that didn't even exist 5 years ago. What we saw in our research is that when you invest in learning and just offering learning to your employees, that they're staying 30% longer. And so when you think about some of these critical fields where there are, job and employee shortages like healthcare, if we think about advanced manufacturing, if you can have someone stay 6 months longer, a year longer, that significantly reduces your talent costs. And so really seeing how we can use this talent as an investment. And companies have been very creative about this. Large companies are partnering with folks and training providers like Guild Education to offer education as a benefit. We've seen small and medium sized businesses leverage partnerships with career centers and workforce boards in their local community to bring actual new trainings to the table that are funded by government funding that's available for any company. The second thing that they're doing is really leaning on their partners to offer some of these trainings and benefits and leaning on their expertise to do it so it's at a manageable cost and resources. But the idea is that we're getting creative around learning and really getting creative around advancement. Another thing that I love that companies are doing is they're looking at cross training opportunities as professional development, and then having employees who might be at the front line or might be working in marketing to actually trade positions to see what is it like to work in their counterpart's shoes. What should they be thinking about marketing and changing their perspective if they've been on the front line? What are they actually hearing for customers? So it becomes a beautiful opportunity for one to learn about your colleagues, to cross train and really think about your position, job role, what you can do to help another employee at your company. And that counts as professional development when done right, giving them the opportunity and then working with a manager, a direct manager to allow for a debrief of that experience and asking that employee after they've cross trained, based on what you experienced, how are you thinking about your job differently?
Angela, I want to read a passage from the book that I think illustrates the win-win workplace perfectly. The passage says, imagine two employees working side by side. One approaches their work like a renter in an apartment. They complete the tasks outlined in their lease, the job description, and move on, doing just what they need to do in order to get their security deposit back. The other employee acts like a homeowner. They take initiative, invest in improvements, and care about the overall health of the building, the company. Which do you want on your team? End of the passage. But it's obvious, right? Which one you want. How do organizations start to move in this direction of like giving more ownership to employees? Because as you say throughout the whole book, the win-win employee, they're taking ownership. They feel empowered. They can bring their whole self to work and they feel like they're contributing to something that's bigger than themselves. How do we do this?
It starts, and I write about this in chapter 8 and 9. And the reason why we want to get to this ownership mindset is exactly what you said, Brandon. It's about having employees who are invested, who are looking around the corner. When we think about the future of work and we think about how dynamically companies are changing now, we need employees to invest now more than ever. It's not enough for them to put their heads down and say, okay, I produced 10 things, gold star for me. It's about what are we succeeding at as a team? And you're really building that culture when you start listening. It's just like when we were talked about earlier in our conversation about the delivery driver. He had an idea, and what he was doing in that moment by offering that idea, really exemplifies that ownership mindset. He goes, I know there's a better way to save the company money. I'm going to offer this up. In that zero sum, he could have just put his head down and said, okay, if this is the way they want me to go, this is the way they want me to go. He wouldn't have been penalized for that, but the company has a missed opportunity if he's still operating in that frame. And so the more that we can listen to our employees, the more that we can parrot back to them what we're doing based on their feedback and ideas, and also give them that invitation. And that's what the CHI Doors did in the case study with the delivery driver, offering the employees the invitation saying, we'd like your ideas. This is the challenges that we're having. If you have an idea on how we can increase productivity, how we can do things better, let us know. And sharing and actually incentivizing that behavior. Because over time, people will have to refresh from that zero sum workplace that we've always had where people have asked us our ideas and they've not done anything. They've been thrown in a suggestion box. What we'll have to do as modern leadership in this moment is over and over again, show to our employees that we're operationalizing their insights, giving them that invitation. And over time, we're building that muscle. So it becomes just practice of what we're doing, part and parcel with the company culture, that you actually give your ideas, that management is listening. They're listening with an eye towards operationalizing this insights. And we've seen this with these win-win companies, workplace companies that are in the book. It becomes part of their value and their mission in doing that. And that's the ideal state where we want to be.
Angela, if an organization adopts the ideas in the entire book, we didn't cover every single thing. What dimensions should we be measuring to know that we're actually getting the return on the investment?
Absolutely. And I want to be clear with your listeners. The pillars in the book, there are 9 of them. The first is centering worker voice, and the last is ending with this ownership mindset. When we think about measuring, every company that we interviewed during our research, they weren't implementing every pillar. So we're not saying that everyone needs to do all the things. That's number one. What we're saying is foundational is that you should be listening, and you should be listening with an eye towards operation. Once you identify an opportunity or a problem of practice, you can look at one implementing one of the pillars that speaks to that opportunity. And then the measurement piece of it is measuring what's most important to your company. So I'll give you an example. When we talked about the idea of reimagining benefits, if you're piloting what new benefits are, first you're going to start with that baseline of how do your employees feel about the benefits today? So that could be a short 4 to 5 question survey. So you're getting a baseline. Based on their feedback, you're going to ask them, how do they feel about it? Which benefits would help them most? Which benefits would they eliminate if they had the choice? And then you're going to pilot some changes. Once you pilot the changes, what you want to do is give that survey again. And you want to follow up that survey as you get those results, having your direct managers have one-to-one conversations and with their individual employees and with their teams and say, okay, it's been 4 or 5 months of this new benefits. Which ones are you using? Which ones are you not? And once you have that baseline, you can compare 3, 6 months later and say, has there been some improvement? Are more people using it? Are they saying that they're happy with their benefits? Which are the ones that are saying that are still not helpful? Because what you can do with that information is say the ones that people are not enjoying, they're not seeing the value, we should relook at those. So again, it's this continuous learning. It's almost like with that lean startup mentality that we're continuing to iterate over time till we're getting to a place where we're offering the benefits that people actually value and that are actually we see have the most impact on the business.
Good stuff, Angela. The book is called The Win-Win Workplace: How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Success. I really appreciate this awesome conversation. Where's the best place for people to either buy the book or to check out all the other work that you're doing?
Absolutely. So if they go to readwinwinworkplace.com, they can check out the research, the links to buy the book. Also, I would love to give an invitation to your listeners. We are hosting the Win-Win Workplace Summit May 5th and 6th in Chicago, and we're bringing together chief learning officers, CHROs, and some CEOs who have actually implemented these strategies, and they're going to talk about the ROI that they've received. And we'll have, leaders in the audience who are thinking about going on this journey. And I'm going to give a 20% discount code to any of your listeners who'd like to attend. Again, that's the Win-Win Workplace Summit, and I'll give you the link so they can get a 20% discount.
My guest today has been Dr. Angela Jackson, the author of The Win-Win Workplace. Angela, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you.
Oh, Brandon, thank you again for having me and for the work that you're doing.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.